I can speak 7 languages. The boy's voice cut through the silence, fragile yet unshaken. Across the room, the billionaire's laughter echoed like a blade, sharp and cruel. In that instant, the air froze, because if this child was telling the truth, everything the powerful man believed about wealth, privilege, and worth would shatter. Lean closer. I'll whisper a secret. What happened next nearly cost the billionaire his empire and lifted a forgotten family from the shadows. Stay with me just one more minute, and I'll tell you how a boy from the Bronx, guided by his mother's quiet strength, turned humiliation into triumph. So tell me, if you were in that boy's shoes, facing the smirk of a man who thinks you're nothing, how would you feel? Leave your thoughts below, and may your day be filled with courage and kindness. The night before had ended without rest, and the morning broke with the bitter chill of a New York winter that bit at exposed skin and turned every breath into a pale cloud. The city moved like a machine, relentless and indifferent, its streets clogged with yellow cabs and bundled commuters clutching paper cups of coffee. From far above, in the steel heart of Manhattan, the Stanton Global Tower gleamed against the gray sky, its mirrored surface reflecting both power and distance, like a fortress built not of stone, but of wealth. The story of Clara Johnson and her son Miles did not begin here, yet this was the place where their path intersected with forces far beyond their world. They had walked through snow-slush sidewalks to stand inside that lobby, small against the vast glass doors, determined to climb steps never meant for them. Clara Johnson, 62 years old, carried the weariness of a lifetime in the lines of her face, though her eyes still held a quiet flame that no hardship could snuff out. She was a black woman, shaped by the Bronx thin from years of missed meals, shoulders bent from endless part-time jobs, yet still upright with a dignity she refused to lose. Her coat, once navy, had faded into a grayish hue, its elbows threadbare, the seams at the cuffs fraying. Around her neck was a scarf knit decades ago, pilled but warm, a relic of better days. Beside her stood her son Miles, 14, small for his age but alert, his skin smooth and dark, his hair cropped short, his backpack hanging loose on one shoulder. The boy's eyes carried both shyness and an unexpected brightness, as if behind them lived a world too large for his frame. Together they looked like shadows walking into a world built of light and steel, yet Clara's hand on her son's arm was steady, her silent message clear. We belong, even if they think we don't. Inside the lobby, the air smelled of polished marble and expensive perfume. Men in tailored suits and women in pencil skirts hurried past, their heels clicking against stone floors that echoed wealth in every step. Security guards in navy uniforms stood watchful but indifferent, scanning badges of executives who hardly noticed them. Clara guided Miles toward the row of elevators, her palms damp but her jaw set. They were here for something simple yet monumental, a chance at a small internship. Unpaid perhaps, but an opening, a crack in the walls of Stanton Global. To outsiders it was nothing, but to Clara it was everything, because she knew opportunity rarely knocked on the doors of families like hers. As the elevator doors opened with a soft chime, Clara and Miles stepped inside, their reflections caught in the mirrored panels. A moment later, footsteps echoed across the lobby. A group approached. Richard Stanton himself, the 56-year-old titan of industry, flanked by 2 assistants. Stanton was tall, his build lean but commanding, with silver streaks in his dark hair brushed neatly back. His bespoke charcoal suit fit like armor, his silk tie a deep burgundy, his shoes polished to a shine that mirrored the lights above. His face bore the sharp features of a man who had fought and conquered, but his blue-gray eyes were colder than the morning air, scanning the world as if weighing its worth in profit and loss. His assistants, younger men in their 30s, wore lighter suits, their expressions eager to please, carrying tablets and folders like knights carrying shields. Stanton stepped into the elevator, his assistants close behind, their presence filling the small space with the scent of cologne and expensive wool. He was mid-conversation, speaking in fluent German into a sleek phone pressed against his ear. His tone was clipped, authoritative, the language sharp like steel beams locking into place. Miles tilted his head, listening, his lips pressing together as if holding a secret. Clara lowered her gaze to the floor, pulling her coat tighter, instinctively trying to make herself smaller. She knew who stood beside her. One of the richest men in America, a man whose decisions could shift markets, and here she was, in his elevator, carrying nothing but her son's fragile hope. The assistants noticed the mother and son, their eyes flicking toward Clara's worn coat and Miles's scuffed sneakers. One of them smirked, whispering too loudly, "Internship? Here? Must be lost." The other chuckled, adding, "This isn't the community center, ma'am." Their laughter was low but sharp, meant to slice dignity into ribbons. Clara's cheeks flushed, but she said nothing, her hand squeezing Miles's shoulder. Miles straightened his back, his jaw set, yet his eyes flickered with something more than embarrassment, something closer to defiance. Stanton ended his call, slipping the phone into his pocket, and glanced briefly at the pair. His expression barely moved, a subtle lift of one brow, a faint curl at the corner of his mouth. It was not curiosity. It was dismissal. For Clara, that look cut deeper than words. She had faced decades of doors slammed in her face, jobs that never called back, landlords who sneered at her rent checks, doctors who didn't hear her pain. She recognized the gaze of a man who had already decided what she and her son were worth. Nothing. Yet beneath her silence, her thoughts beat against her chest. If today my boy can glimpse one chance, even one, then every humiliation will have been worth it. She swallowed hard, raised her chin a fraction, and looked straight ahead at the glowing numbers above the elevator door. Miles, meanwhile, caught pieces of Stanton's earlier conversation in German, replaying them in his mind. He understood enough to sense the urgency of deadlines, the sharp edge of negotiations. Language was more than words to him. It was a key, a secret code that unlocked doors people thought were locked forever. His heart pounded, not from fear but from recognition. He knew he could have joined that conversation, could have spoken with the same fluency, maybe even better. But he stayed quiet, his mother's trembling hand a reminder that now was not yet the time. His moment, if it came, would have to be earned. The elevator climbed higher, floor after floor flashing past. The assistants continued their quiet chuckles, shooting glances at Clara's scarf, Miles's backpack, their own reflections in the mirrored wall gleaming with self-satisfaction. Stanton said nothing, his attention already elsewhere, mind occupied with numbers and deals. Clara kept her silence, but inside she repeated a prayer learned long ago. "Lord, just one open door. Just one." The hum of the elevator filled the silence, mingling with the heavy weight of class, power, and judgment. When the doors finally slid open with a chime, Stanton and his entourage stepped out first, their shoes clicking against the polished floor of the executive level. Clara and Miles remained behind a second longer, gathering themselves before following. In that pause, Clara's inner voice whispered to her son, though no words left her lips, "Miles, you belong here as much as any of them. Don't forget that." Miles met his mother's gaze and nodded faintly, understanding without speech. He felt the weight of her faith pressing gently but firmly upon his shoulders. As the elevator doors closed behind them, the moment remained suspended in the air like frost that refused to melt. A family from the Bronx had stepped into the fortress of glass and steel, brushed against the dismissive laughter of power, and though the world saw only poverty, inside Clara's chest lived a conviction unbreakable. If today my son sees even a glimpse of possibility, every locked gate, every sneer, every insult will be worth it. The first steps had been taken, fragile but real, onto glass stairs that might yet carry them higher. The elevator ride had ended, but the echo of mocking laughter and Richard Stanton's dismissive glance still clung to Clara and Miles as they followed the polished marble corridor toward the reception area of Stanton Global's executive floor. The morning light pouring through the vast glass windows painted everything in cold brilliance, and for a brief moment, Clara felt as though she and her son were standing exposed on a stage, every flaw of their lives magnified beneath the spotlight of wealth. She held her head low, but her grip on Miles's arm tightened, her silent reminder urging him to stay composed. Miles walked beside her, small in stature compared to the towering suits around him, but his eyes carried the strange glow of a boy who had overheard a language that belonged to men like Stanton and understood it as if it were his own. At the reception desk sat a woman in her early 40s named Deborah Lane, her blonde hair pulled tightly into a bun, glasses perched on her nose, her gray suit immaculate. She looked up from her computer, her expression cool and professional, yet when her gaze landed on Clara's worn coat and Miles's faded backpack, a shadow of disdain curled across her lips. "Yes?" she asked curtly, her tone clipped, as though speaking to intruders rather than guests. Clara cleared her throat and explained softly that she had come to request a place for her son as an intern, a chance to learn and contribute, however small. Deborah arched one brow, her pen tapping lightly against the desk, before she allowed a thin smile that was less kindness than mockery. One of Stanton's assistants, still hovering nearby with his tablet in hand, leaned over to Deborah and whispered just loudly enough for Clara and Miles to hear, "She wants an internship. Here? Maybe he can mop the floors." The words hung in the air like smoke, choking Clara's resolve, but before she could respond, Miles stepped forward, his voice steady though his hands trembled slightly at his sides. "I can do more than mop floors," he said, his tone clear yet respectful. Deborah's smile widened, amused by the audacity, and the assistant chuckled under his breath. Richard Stanton, who had been reviewing a folder of documents, turned his head just enough to catch the scene, his cold eyes narrowing with detached interest. Not yet care, but perhaps curiosity sparked by defiance. Deborah crossed her arms and asked, "And what exactly can you do, young man?" Miles paused for a moment, his throat dry, but then he lifted his chin and spoke with a confidence that surprised even his mother. "I can speak 7 languages." His words sliced through the hum of the office, startling even the assistants into silence. For a second there was no sound but the muffled ringing of distant phones, and then Richard Stanton's laughter burst forth, deep and mocking, the sound bouncing off glass and steel like the crack of a whip. 7 languages? This child from the Bronx? He shook his head with incredulity, his laughter spilling into the space, feeding the smirks on the faces of his staff. "Boy, I doubt you can even read a full book in English." Clara's cheeks burned, her stomach twisting in humiliation, but she remained rooted, refusing to drag her son away. Miles, though, did not flinch. Instead, he took a slow breath and answered calmly, his voice neither loud nor timid. "English," he began, before switching seamlessly into Spanish, then French, each syllable pronounced with clarity. His tone shifted again into German, the very language Stanton had used moments earlier, followed by the musical cadence of Italian, the clipped consonants of Russian, the flowing rhythm of Mandarin, and the rolling sounds of Portuguese. With each transition, the room seemed to shrink, the air tightening as secretaries paused their typing and assistants ceased their whispers, their disbelief turning into stunned attention. Richard's laughter faltered. He leaned back slightly, his hands clasping the folder more tightly, his lips curling into a skeptical sneer. "Impressive tricks," he said, his voice tinged with irritation. "But anyone can memorize phrases from a tourist guide. That doesn't make you a linguist, and it certainly doesn't make you fit for this company." His assistants nodded eagerly, parroting his disdain, but the unease in the room betrayed their forced confidence. Deborah cleared her throat nervously, unsure whether to side with her employer's arrogance or the undeniable proof she had just heard. Clara stood taller now, pride swelling against her fear, her hand trembling, but her heart fierce with belief in her son. Miles did not raise his voice or argue. Instead, he looked Stanton directly in the eyes, his expression calm yet firm, and replied, "I didn't memorize phrases, sir. I live these languages. I study them every day at the library, and I practice until I can think in them. You said I couldn't read a book in English, but I've read books in all of these languages." His words, simple yet charged with conviction, landed heavily in the silence. Stanton's sneer deepened, but behind his eyes something flickered, a recognition he refused to admit. Clara felt her chest swell with equal parts fear and pride. Her son had spoken truth not only to power but against it. For a brief moment, the assistants shifted uncomfortably, the smirks gone from their faces. Deborah fiddled with her pen, her mask of superiority slipping. The room, moments earlier full of mockery, now bristled with tension, and in the center of it stood a boy from the Bronx declaring his worth with nothing but words. Clara inhaled sharply, her mind whispering prayers that this act of courage would not backfire, that it would plant a seed rather than spark rejection. Richard Stanton tapped the edge of his folder against the desk. his eyes narrowing once again, his lips curving into a colder smile. Finally, he spoke, his tone measured but still dripping with superiority. "Fine," he said, drawing out the word as though granting a favor. "If you are what you claim, then prove it. This afternoon, I have a video call with partners in Zurich. Sit in the meeting. Translate for me in real time. If you succeed, perhaps you deserve a place. If you fail, you'll walk out of this building and never return." His assistants smirked again, reassured by their employer's control, and Deborah let out a quiet sigh of relief, grateful the moment had passed without further fracture. Clara felt her heart drop and soar at once, terror at the risk, pride at the opportunity. Miles swallowed hard but nodded, his young face set in quiet determination. He didn't boast, did not flinch, only replied, "Yes, sir, I'll be ready." His words hung in the air like a promise, not only to Stanton, but to his mother and to himself. Clara pressed her hand gently to her son's back, her whisper audible only to him. "We've come this far. Keep walking." The hum of the office resumed, but the current had shifted, for a door that had been locked moments before now stood cracked open, its hinges creaking under the weight of possibility. The afternoon arrived heavy with tension, the winter sun dimmed by clouds that pressed against the glass walls of Stanton Global's conference floor. Hours earlier, Miles had accepted Richard Stanton's challenge without hesitation, his promise to translate in real time, standing like a fragile bridge between humiliation and possibility. Now, Clara sat with her son in a waiting lounge just outside the boardroom, her hands clasped in her lap, her knuckles pale from pressure, while Miles silently rehearsed phrases in his mind, his lips moving without sound. The boy knew the task ahead was more than language. It was proof of existence, a chance to declare that he and his mother were not shadows, but voices worth hearing. The boardroom was a cathedral of power-long mahogany table polished to a mirror sheen, high-backed leather chairs aligned with military precision, and walls of glass framing the skyline of Manhattan like a backdrop to the theater of wealth. Executives in suits filed in, murmuring to each other, their watches gleaming, their expressions somewhere between boredom and curiosity at the unusual addition to their meeting. Richard Stanton entered last, tall and composed, his silver-streaked hair immaculate, his eyes colder than the steel beams that held the tower aloft. He gestured toward Miles with a faint curl of his hand, a signal to take the seat at the corner, as though reminding everyone present that the boy was a guest, only by Stanton's permission. At precisely 2 o'clock, the large screen at the end of the table flickered to life, revealing the faces of Zurich Partners men in their 50s, with sharp features, dressed in tailored suits, their German accents thick as they began to discuss contractual terms. Miles's heart thudded in his chest, but he steadied his breathing, listening intently as the first speaker launched into a string of clauses and conditions. His ears caught every nuance, every shift in tone, and when Stanton nodded toward him, he began to translate in crisp, fluent English, his voice calm, measured, unhurried. Executives around the table lifted their brows in mild surprise. Some exchanged glances, others leaned forward as if suddenly alert. For nearly 20 minutes, the conversation flowed smoothly. Miles translating back and forth with precision, his young voice filling the room with clarity. Clara, seated quietly near the door, clasped her scarf in both hands, her heart swelling with pride each time her son's words bridged continents. But then it happened. One Zurich partner used the term Fristverlängerung, speaking quickly about deadlines, but in his haste the word was clipped, sounding dangerously like Fristverkürzung, its opposite. The difference was everything extension versus reduction, a clause that could shift millions of dollars. Stanton, focused on his notes, did not react, but Miles's ears caught the slip instantly. His pulse spiked, but he did not falter. He raised his hand politely, his German soft yet firm as he addressed the man on the screen. "Entschuldigen Sie. Ich glaube, Sie meinten Verlängerung, nicht Verkürzung." The partner blinked, then nodded with relief, correcting himself. Miles translated smoothly into English, ensuring clarity for the boardroom. The executives around the table looked startled, realizing what had nearly been agreed upon. Stanton's pen froze above his paper, his blue-gray eyes narrowing on the boy with something more complex than disdain. In that instant, silence hung heavy, the weight of millions resting on the shoulders of a 14-year-old from the Bronx. The moment passed, and the conversation continued, but the current had shifted. Stanton's executives whispered among themselves, some impressed, others uneasy. Miles pressed on with unwavering focus, translating with a rhythm that made the meeting not only possible, but effective. Clara's eyes glistened as she watched, her chest aching with the fierce love of a mother who had sacrificed everything for this moment. She remembered nights spent scrubbing offices, her fingers raw, so her son could sit in a public library instead of wandering the streets. She remembered the small dinners of bread and soup, the rent overdue, the constant humiliation of poverty, and now here was her boy, correcting billionaires in flawless German. When the call ended, the Zurich partners smiling and satisfied, the screen went dark and silence settled over the room. One of Stanton's senior executives, a heavy-set man with a ruddy face named Charles Whitmore, scoffed aloud. "Lucky guess," he muttered, flipping his pen onto the table. His tone carried the disdain of a man unwilling to admit being outshined by a child. A ripple of nervous laughter followed from a few others, eager to realign themselves with authority. Clara's face tightened, but she remained silent, unwilling to jeopardize her son's moment. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small brown paper packet, sliding it discreetly onto Miles's lap. A sandwich she had bought that morning, the receipt still tucked inside. "Eat, son," she whispered softly. "A hero doesn't need a cape, only the strength to keep going." Miles looked at her, his eyes shining, and took a small bite, the simplest meal becoming a sacred offering between mother and child. Stanton, standing at the head of the table, said nothing at first. He watched them with an unreadable expression, his fingers steepled, his jaw taut. His mind replayed the near disaster that had been prevented, the flawless poise of the boy, and the quiet resilience of the mother who had endured ridicule in his presence yet had not broken. Something inside him shifted, though pride forced him to keep his words measured. Finally, Stanton closed his folder and spoke, his voice calm but resonant. "The meeting is concluded," he said. "You may all return to your duties." The executives rose, some casting lingering glances at Miles, others avoiding his gaze altogether. Charles muttered again under his breath, unwilling to concede respect, but no one echoed him this time. Clara stood, her hands smoothing the wrinkles from her coat, her heart still pounding with equal parts fear and pride. Miles rose beside her, his shoulders squared, his eyes steady, no longer the timid boy who had entered the tower that morning, but someone reshaped by trial. As the room emptied, Stanton remained by the window, his silhouette outlined by the fading winter light. He didn't look at Clara or Miles directly, but his voice carried across the space with unexpected weight. "Not bad," he murmured, the words simple but heavy with reluctant acknowledgement. Clara caught the faintest flicker in his gaze, a recognition he had tried to deny. She held her son's hand tightly, whispering a prayer of thanks, and together they stepped out of the boardroom, leaving behind the echoes of laughter replaced by the first fragile notes of respect. The boardroom had emptied, yet Richard Stanton remained restless, his tall frame outlined against the skyline as if the steel and glass of the city itself were urging him to hold firm to skepticism. The boy had performed beyond expectation in the Zurich meeting, but Stanton's pride clung stubbornly to its doubts. When Miles and Clara were invited back the next morning, the atmosphere was no warmer. In fact, it seemed colder, sharpened by the whispers of executives who muttered about luck and coincidence. Richard looked at them both with a measured stare, his words heavy with disdain as he declared, "Without a top university to verify it, your so-called talent is nothing more than an illusion." The sting of his words might have bent a lesser spirit, but Clara Johnson, who had spent 62 years enduring the weight of dismissal, did not lower her gaze this time. She lifted her chin, her back straight despite the fatigue carved into her body, and spoke with a quiet strength that carried through the room. "If you truly believe in justice, Mr. Stanton, then let my son be tested, not by your opinion, not by your executives, but by independent experts. If he fails, we will leave and never trouble you again. But if he succeeds, you will have to face what that means." Her voice was steady, her eyes unflinching, and for the first time Richard hesitated, caught between pride and principle. He agreed, though with a smirk, arranging for 3 independent linguists to arrive later that day. They were not company men, but seasoned academics. Dr. Elaine Chen, a professor in her 50s with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, Dr. Marcus Varela, a younger scholar in his 30s with an eager expression hidden behind round glasses, and Dr. Hans Kruger, a retired German translator in his 60s, stern-faced and meticulous. Each carried folders thick with texts and transcripts, their presence adding an air of gravity to what might have seemed a game. Clara sat quietly at the side, her hands folded in her lap, while Miles stood before them with nothing but his backpack and the fire in his eyes. The test began with simple translation passages in English, French, and Spanish, then escalated to complex legal documents in German, Mandarin, and Russian. Miles read quickly, his voice clear, shifting tones and syntax with precision that startled even Dr. Kruger, who prided himself on detecting errors. Then came simultaneous interpretation. The linguist spoke in rapid succession, deliberately fast and full of idioms, but Miles kept pace without faltering, his words flowing smooth as water. Hours passed, yet his energy did not flag, and by the time they concluded, silence filled the boardroom not from disbelief, but from awe. Dr. Chen placed her glasses on the table, her voice firm as she announced, "This boy demonstrates fluency at a professional level in at least 7 languages, near professional in the others. He is not a parlor trick. He is the real thing." Dr. Varela nodded enthusiastically, adding, "In my classes, I have never seen this ability in someone his age, not even close." Dr. Kruger, though slower to speak, finally admitted, "His German is precise, astonishingly so for a non-native speaker. I cannot deny what I have heard." The experts signed documents attesting to his proficiency, their signatures echoing like gavel strikes. Richard, arms crossed, could not refute them, though his jaw tightened as if chewing on defeat. But Miles was not finished. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a stack of papers bound together with a simple clip. "I have something else to show you," he said quietly, laying the report on the polished table. Richard raised an eyebrow, the executives leaned forward, and Clara's breath caught in her chest. Miles opened the pages to reveal a detailed analysis of Stanton Global's past contracts, pointing out linguistic errors that had altered meaning, caused delays, or even cost the company potential partners. He spoke with calm authority, noting misused legal terms, mistranslations of technical phrases, and cultural nuances overlooked in international negotiations. The room grew still as he continued. Miles explained how he had studied publicly available documents, corporate statements, and press releases, tracking patterns of mistakes that revealed systemic weaknesses. Then he proposed a solution, an internal training program, cost-effective and accessible, developed in collaboration with the Bronx Public Library where he himself had learned. "It would not only save millions in the future," he said, "but it would also open doors for young people like me. People who don't have privilege, but have the will to work." His voice did not waver, though his hands trembled slightly above the papers, betraying the courage it took to speak truth to power. Richard Stanton stared at the boy as though seeing him for the first time, his cold eyes flickering with something unspoken. The executives murmured among themselves, some impressed, others defensive, but none could deny the clarity of the evidence. Clara, standing beside her son now, said nothing, but her gaze was fierce, her dark eyes bright as if challenging Richard directly. "Now you must decide. Will you cling to your prejudice, or will you admit what stands before you?" Her silence spoke louder than any words, the unyielding love of a mother who had carried her child through storms and would not bow to disdain. For a long moment, the boardroom held its breath. The papers lay open, the signatures of experts alongside the corrections of a boy from the Bronx, a living contradiction to every assumption Richard Stanton had made. Outside, the winter sky pressed heavy against the glass, but inside, something fragile yet powerful had shifted. Richard did not speak. Not yet, but his silence was no longer dismissal. It was hesitation, the kind that comes when certainty begins to crumble. Clara watched him steadily, her heart pounding, but her resolve firm, knowing that justice had been demanded and delivered, and now the choice was his alone. The days that followed were filled with murmurs in Stanton Global's hallways, whispers of doubt, resistance, and pride wounded by the spectacle of a boy and his mother challenging the foundations of privilege. Yet in the silence of his office, Richard Stanton wrestled with what he had seen. The flawless tests, the damning report of errors, and the unspoken challenge in Clara Johnson's eyes. For a man who had built his empire on certainty, the ground beneath him now trembled. Pride urged him to dismiss it all as an anomaly, but conscience, long dormant, stirred uneasily, pressing against the armor he had worn for decades. After many days of deliberation, Richard emerged before his board with a decision that stunned not only his company, but the wider community beyond its glass walls. He announced the creation of the Open Doors Scholarship, a fund dedicated to saving the Bronx Public Library from closure and transforming it into a hub of language and opportunity. Executives exchanged uneasy glances, their spreadsheets unable to calculate the value of such a gesture, but Richard's tone brooked no debate. He continued by declaring that Miles Johnson would be hired as a junior consultant, guided by seasoned mentors to ensure his prodigious talent would flourish. Gasps rippled through the room, disbelief colliding with grudging admiration. And finally, he turned toward Clara, her weathered hands folded calmly in her lap, and said with clarity, "You will serve as community liaison, the bridge between this company and the neighborhoods it too often forgets." The words fell like a gavel, rewriting the roles of those who had been dismissed as invisible. News of the decision spread quickly, newspapers seizing on the unexpected shift of a billionaire long known for his icy detachment. Some called it charity, others strategy, but those who saw Clara and Miles in their modest Bronx neighborhood understood it as something deeper. A crack in the walls of indifference, a light spilling through. Clara accepted her new role with quiet humility, still living in her small apartment, still cooking simple meals. But now her phone rang with voices that once ignored her, and her steps carried her into boardrooms as an equal rather than a shadow. For Miles, life became a whirlwind of study and work, his days divided between school, mentorship at Stanton Global, and evenings at the library where children gathered eagerly to learn words from worlds beyond their own. 6 months later, the Bronx Public Library was no longer a place of dust and dim light, but a beacon alive with energy. Its walls, once silent, now rang with the laughter of children reciting words in Spanish, Mandarin, and German, their voices mixing into a chorus of possibility. Volunteers filled the halls, programs expanded, and shelves once neglected gleamed with newly donated books. In one corner of the library, Clara stood distributing loaves of bread and small cartons of milk, her smile soft as she greeted each child by name. To the community, she was no longer just an aging woman in a frayed coat. She was a pillar, the one who had carried dignity into places where it had been forgotten. Miles, now taller and more confident, stood at the front of a small classroom within the library, chalk in hand, guiding children through the intricacies of language with a patience far beyond his years. He wore a simple shirt and jeans, his backpack still worn but heavier with knowledge. The children watched him with admiration, not because he was extraordinary, but because he showed them that ordinary beginnings did not define their ends. His lessons were not just about grammar or vocabulary, but about resilience, about daring to believe that their voices mattered. For each child who repeated after him, a barrier fell, and for each barrier that fell, Clara's sacrifices found new meaning. On a quiet evening, the library hosted a small graduation ceremony for its language program, attended by families, neighbors, and even a few curious executives from Stanton Global. The room was decorated with paper banners in different languages, hand-drawn by the children themselves, the scent of fresh bread mingling with the ink of new books. Clara moved among the crowd with gentle grace, handing out small plates of food, while Richard Stanton, uncharacteristically subdued, sat in the back row, his sharp suit blending awkwardly with the warmth of the gathering. He watched with a stillness that betrayed reflection, his gaze following the boy he once mocked, the woman he once dismissed. When the time came for Miles to speak, he stepped forward, his voice steady though his hands gripped the podium tightly. "My mother taught me that kindness doesn't have to be loud," he said, his words carrying through the library like a gentle bell. "It doesn't have to make speeches or demand recognition. Real kindness guides you quietly, like a hand on your shoulder when you're afraid, or a light in the dark when you're lost. That's why we're here. Because kindness opened a door." The room fell silent, then erupted in applause, the sound raw and genuine, echoing off the high ceilings like thunder born from hope. Richard rose from his chair and walked slowly to the front, his polished shoes strangely quiet against the worn floorboards. He extended his hand to Clara, his voice lower now, touched by something almost human. "Thank you," he said, pausing as if the words were foreign on his tongue. "Thank you for reminding me that even steel can grow warm." Clara clasped his hand firmly, her eyes meeting his with neither fear nor resentment, only the calm strength of a woman who had always known the truth. In that handshake, worlds collided, the world of wealth and the world of struggle. And for once, they did not repel, but held, however briefly, in fragile harmony. As the evening drew to a close, children ran laughing through the aisles, their voices carrying the promise of futures unchained from silence. Clara stood by the doorway, her coat still patched but her posture unbowed, watching as her son packed away his books with the quiet pride of a teacher. Richard lingered for a moment longer, then departed without fanfare, slipping into the night with the echo of Miles's words still circling in his mind. The library lights glowed behind him, a beacon against the darkness, a reminder that home was not a structure of walls and roofs, but a verb, an action, a commitment to lift each other higher. And so it ended. Not with grand declarations or fireworks, but with bread shared, lessons taught, and hearts changed. For Clara, once invisible, recognition had come not through wealth or titles, but through love, resilience, and the courage to demand justice. For Miles, once mocked, acceptance had blossomed not from privilege but from proof, determination, and the hand of a mother who believed when no one else would. And for Richard Stanton, once cold as steel, there remained the flicker of warmth, a reminder that no fortress is impregnable to the quiet power of humanity. In the end, this story is not only about a boy who spoke many languages or a mother who never stopped believing. It is about every person who has ever been told they were less, every dream that was dismissed because of background, color, or poverty. True strength is born in quiet places, where courage is shaped by struggle, and love becomes the fuel to keep moving forward. Those who rise above prejudice remind us that dignity is not given by society, it is claimed by the human spirit. If this touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment with your thoughts, because your voice matters too. Subscribe to the channel so that together we can keep telling stories that honor resilience and compassion. And may God bless you and your family with courage, kindness, and the faith to walk through every closed door until it opens.